Welcome everybody to the American Lobster Management Board meeting. We'll call the meeting to order. I wanted to start off just saying a quick thanks to Commissioner Dan Mckiernan for his stewardship of the board over the past couple of years. So thank you very much, Dan, for a great job. And I sort of watched you keenly over the past couple of years because this is my very first board meeting that I'm chairing. And so I offer that comment so that the folks out there can have a little patience with me as I kind of get the hang of this. I've chaired a lot of technical groups, but never a board meeting before. So I'm sure it's a bit different. So just ask for a little patience. With that, why don't we get rolling here? We have been issued an agenda. Let's take that up as our first order of business here. To the board, are there any modifications to the agenda as it was published? Please raise your hand. Go ahead, Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will have an item under other business regarding the tracker addendum. It'll only take a minute.
Thank you, Pat. And I've noted that. We'll take that up under other business. Any other modifications to the agenda? Please raise your hand. And Pat, I'm going to go ahead and put your hand down just so I can keep track. Okay, seeing no other modifications, are there any objections from the board to approving the agenda as modified? Please raise your hand. Seeing no hands, we will call the agenda approved. So let's move on to the minutes. So we've been issued minutes from our last meeting to the board. Are there any modifications to the minutes from our last meeting? Any additions, edits, deletions, anything of that nature? Please raise your hand.
Just one point of clarification, Mr. Chair.
Sure.
Today you have the minutes for both the October and December meetings.
Oh, sorry, you missed that there. So just to clarify, we have two sets of minutes. That's why the proceedings were so long. So any modifications from anyone for either October or December, those board meetings, please raise your hand. Seeing no hands, we will call the minutes from October and December 2021. Oh, sorry, I should back up. Didn't see any modifications. So is there any objection to approving the minutes from October or December 2021 from anyone on the board? Okay, seeing no hands, now we will call those minutes approved. Thank you all very much. Got through the first two things. So let's move on to the bulk of the agenda here. We are going to get into a discussion on Addendum 27. What we're doing with this agenda item is we are going over the draft. So Caitlin will give us a presentation on the draft addendum. We will then take some time for any questions that folks have. Then we'll take any comments from the board or any modifications, but the goal with this agenda item is to approve the draft addendum for public comment. So with that, Caitlin, sorry. We will, I'll be sure to make some time for, actually, maybe I'll do that here since it's on the agenda. Any public comment before we get into the agenda? This would be for items not currently on the agenda. So any public wishing to offer anything to the board before we begin our deliberations on Addendum 27, please raise your hand. I'll let the pause get a little bit more uncomfortable just to make sure. Okay, I don't see any hands. I will offer the public opportunities to comment on the agenda at various times during the meeting, so rest assured you'll have other opportunities. All right, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Caitlin, to give us a presentation on Addendum 27.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe the presentation should be showing.
I see it.
All right, great. So as our chair indicated, I'll be presenting on Draft Addendum 27 on increasing protection of the spawning stock in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. And in my presentation today, I'm going to cover the background on this action leading up to this meeting, the objective of the addendum, the proposed timeline for the action, and then I'll go into the details of the proposed options and then wrap up with the board's action for consideration today and next steps. So the board initiated Draft Addendum 27 originally in August 2017 in response to concerns about decreasing trends in Maine's larval settlement survey and the potential that those trends would foreshadow future declines in recruitment and landings. And at that time, the addendum objective was to increase the resiliency of the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock by standardizing management measures across the lobster conservation and management areas, or LCMAs, within the stock. However, Draft Addendum 27 was put on hold for a few years as the board had to prioritize work related to right whale risk reduction efforts. And then in February 2021, after reviewing the 2020 benchmark stock assessment, the board reinitiated work on this addendum with a new motion that changed the focus of the addendum to consider a trigger mechanism such that upon reaching of the trigger, measures would be automatically implemented to improve the biological resiliency of the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. And then since this addendum was originally initiated, we've seen a continuation of the concerns that were noted in the 2015 stock assessment. The settlement surveys over the past 5 years have remained below the 75th percentile of their time series. And since the 2020 stock assessment, we've also seen declines in recruit abundance in the ventless trap survey and trawl surveys for the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. And again, these declines could be indicative of future declines in recruitment and landings. So given this information, the board has tweaked the focus of the addendum with some additional guidance that instructed the plan development team to change the objective from increasing resiliency to increasing protection of spawning stock, to frame the action as responding to continued signs of reduced settlement and recruit indices, and to make the primary goal to increase the overall protection of SSB while also considering management options that are more consistent than status quo. And all of that considered, the revised objective that the board agreed on is, given persistent low settlement indices and recent decreases in recruit indices, the addendum should consider a trigger mechanism such that upon reaching of the trigger, measures would be automatically implemented to increase the overall protection of the spawning stock biomass of the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. So this is our current timeline for Addendum 27. Again, it was reinitiated in February 2021. The PDT, TC, and board then met multiple times over the course of the year to develop the draft addendum document. And today the board is meeting to consider draft addendum 27 for public comment. And if the document is approved for comment today, then hearings could be held in March 2022, and the board could take up the addendum for final action as early as May. So with that, I'm going to move into the proposed options in the addendum. So to address the stated objective, Draft Addendum 27 considers management options that aim to increase the spawning stock biomass through gauge modifications, as well as some options to increase the consistency of measures within and across LCMAs within the stock. For increasing spawning stock biomass, the PDT recommended options that would modify the minimum and maximum gauge sizes based on Lobster Technical Committee advice that gauge sizes are the most likely of the existing biological management measures to have biological impacts on the stock. The technical committee analysis evaluated the impacts of different minimum and maximum sizes for the LCMAs within the stock and found that increasing the minimum legal gauge size in LCMA 1 is projected to result in the largest relative increase in spawning stock biomass compared to other gauge modifications. And this is mainly because the Area 1 fishery is a much larger magnitude, and because the current minimum legal size in Area 1 is significantly below the size at maturity, meaning there's more growth overfishing relative to other areas. And growth overfishing refers to the harvest of lobsters at sizes smaller than the size where their collective biomass and their fishery yield would be the greatest, and when they still have a large scope for additional growth. While growth overfishing is also occurring to some degree in other areas of the stock, the current management minimum gauge sizes in Area 3 and Outer Cape Cod are much closer to the size at maturity, and additionally, landings from those areas only account for a small fraction of the fishery. So therefore, increasing the minimum legal size in Area 1 is projected to result in the greatest benefit to the spawning stock biomass. And decreases to the maximum gauge size are also projected to have some minor impact. Specifically, decreasing the maximum gauge size in Area 3 should have a larger effect relative to increasing the minimum size in Area 3, and also relative to decreasing maximum size for the other LCMAs. But it's still much less of an impact than increasing that minimum gauge size in Area 1. The PDT also recommended options focused on increasing the consistency of management measures, considering that the current disparities between areas creates challenges for stock assessment because the LCMAs are not perfectly aligned with the biological boundaries of the stocks. They also cause issues for law enforcement and hinder interstate commerce when the minimum sizes differ across the states. So for reference, before I go into the proposed changes to the measures, these are the current measures for the areas within the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. And as you can see, there are differences between each of these areas for pretty much each of the measures. The proposed options in the document are separated into two issues. Issue 1 addresses the standardization of a subset of management measures within LCMAs and across the stock. And Issue 2 considers applying either a trigger mechanism or a predetermined schedule to implement biological management measures that are expected to provide increased protection of the spawning stock biomass. Under Issue 1, the two main options are A, status quo, or B, implementing some standardized measures upon approval of the addendum. So option B has 4 sub-options to define what those standardized measures include. B1 includes standardizing measures only within an area where there are current discrepancies. B2 includes standardizing the VNOT requirement across areas. B3 is to standardize the VNOT possession definition. And B4 is to standardize the regulations for issuing additional trap tags for trap losses. And it's important to note here that these sub-options for option B are set up like a menu, and the board could select multiple sub-options. So for more detail on each of the sub-options, B1 would implement standardized measures within an LCMA to the most conservative measure where there are inconsistencies between state and federal regulations. And this would result in the maximum gauge being standardized to 6 3/4 of an inch for state and federal permit holders, and the VNOT possession definition being standardized to 1/8 of an inch with or without cedal hairs in Outer Cape Cod. So that means harvest would be prohibited for a female lobster with a V-shaped notch greater than 1/8 of an inch deep. If option B2 is selected, that would mean a standard V-notch requirement would be implemented for mandatory V-notching for all eggers in Area 1, 3, and Outer Cape Cod. If sub-option B3 were chosen, then a standard V-notch possession definition of 1/8 of an inch with or without cedal hairs would be implemented for all of the areas in the stock. And as a note, any jurisdiction could implement more conservative regulations. And then finally, with sub-option B4, it would be that upon final approval of the addendum, regulations would be standardized across the areas in the stock to limit the issuance of trap tags to equal the harvester trap tag allocation. So that means that surplus tags would not be automatically issued to harvesters, but rather extra tags would only be issued once trap tag losses occur and are documented. So that was issue 1, and now we're moving on to issue 2, which focuses on implementing management measures to increase the protection of the spawning stock. The proposed options under issue 2 consider changes to the minimum and maximum gauge sizes along with corresponding vent sizes for the LCMAs within the stock. And the PDT proposed measures specifically that are expected to both increase SSB and result in the minimum gauge size increasing to meet or exceed the size at 50% maturity for each area. So the vent sizes would also change according to the final minimum gauge size that's implemented in each area. And the proposed measures were based on that technical committee analysis and the recommendations that projected the impacts of various gauge size combinations on the total weight of lobsters landed, number of lobsters landed, spawning stock biomass, and exploitation. And all of that analysis is included in Appendix B of the draft addendum document for reference. And there are two proposed approaches for implementing management changes to increase the protection of spawning stock. The first approach is taken in options A through D, and that's to establish a trigger mechanism that would result in predetermined management changes being triggered upon reaching a defined trigger level based on changes in recruit abundance indices. And the second approach, which is applied in option E, is to establish a predetermined schedule for future changes to the management measures. And the PDT included this option in addition to the trigger mechanism as a proactive approach that would address the issue of growth overfishing by increasing the minimum legal size while the stock conditions are the most favorable. So for more detail on the trigger mechanism, the proposed mechanism establishes either 1 or 2 trigger levels based on recruit conditions observed in 3 surveys that were used in the stock assessment reference abundance model for the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock. And these indices are the combined Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts spring trawl survey index, combined Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts fall trawl survey index, and the model-based ventless trap survey index. And each management trigger is defined by a certain level of decline in the indices from an established reference level, which is the 2016 to 2018 average. And the percent declines in these indices are expected to approximate comparable declines in overall abundance of the stock. And the established trigger levels are related to the abundance reference points that were established by the board. So this is what the trigger index looks like through 2020. The upper left panel is the combined index used for the trigger mechanism, and the proposed trigger levels considered in the addendum are represented by the horizontal lines. So the index is scaled to the reference level. So on the y-axis, 1 represents the reference level, which is again the 2016 to 2018 average. And then the 4 proposed trigger levels are 17%, 20%, 30%, and 32% declines from that reference level. A 17% decline in the abundance is proportional to a decline in the stock abundance to the fishery industry target abundance reference point. And a 32% decline represents the proportional change from the reference abundance level to the boundary between the high and moderate abundance regimes. And all 3 other panels show the other individual indices that make up that combined trigger index in the upper left. So to show you the relationship to the reference abundance, here's that model abundance curve from the stock assessment. And the dotted line up at the top is the fishery industry target reference point, and the dashed horizontal line is the abundance limit. And the trigger levels in the addendum were established to approximate declines in abundance, with the 17% trigger being related to an abundance at the fishery industry target level, and the 32% decline approximating the abundance at the point where the abundance regime changed from moderate to high abundance. So these are the 5 options under issue 2. A is status quo, no additional changes to the measures. B is that gauge size changes would be triggered by a 17% decline in the trigger index and an additional changes triggered by 32% decline. C is that the gauge size changes would be triggered by a 20% decline, and then additional changes triggered by a 30% decline. D is a 17% decline would trigger a series of gradual changes in gauge sizes over several years. And then finally, option E considers changes to the minimum gauge size in Area 1 only on a predetermined schedule as opposed to being triggered by the index. And in the next few slides, I'll just go over each of those in more detail. So under option B, 2 triggers would be established based on observed changes in the indices of recruit abundance. And the first trigger level would be a change in the index greater than or equal to a 17% decline from the reference level. And when that trigger level is reached, the minimum gauge size for Area 1 would increase by 1/16 of an inch from the current size to 3 and 5/16 of an inch for the following fishing year. And all other measures would remain status quo. And then when the second trigger level is reached, which would be a decline greater than or equal to 32% from the reference level, the minimum gauge size for Area 1 would increase again by 1/16 of an inch to 3 3/8 of an inch for the following fishing year. And in addition, the maximum gauge sizes in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod would decrease to 6 inches. And the vent size in LCMA 1 would be adjusted once associated with the second trigger level. So the new vent sizes would be 2 inches by 5 3/4 of an inch rectangular and 2 5/8 of an inch circular. And these vent sizes were chosen to maintain similar retention rates of legal lobsters and protection of sublegal lobsters, and are also consistent with the current vent size used in southern New England for the same minimum gauge size of 3 3/8 of an inch. And just a note here, whenever there's a change to the measures, I'm going to show it in bold in the table, and that will be consistent for the next couple of slides as well. So option C is identical to option B with the exception of the trigger levels. So under this option, the first trigger point would be a 20% decline in the trigger index, and the second trigger point would be a 30% decline, as opposed to 17 and 32% in option B. And the measures that would be implemented when each of these trigger levels is reached are exactly the same as for the last option. Option D considers establishing a trigger level which, upon being reached, would initiate a series of gradual changes in gauge sizes. The minimum gauge size for Area 1 would increase in increments of 1/16 of an inch, and the maximum gauge size for Areas 3 and Outer Cape Cod would decrease in increments of 1/4 of an inch. The first gauge change would be triggered by a 17% decline in the index from the reference level. And then after that first set of changes, incremental changes to the gauge sizes would occur every other year as shown in the table. And the vent size in LCMA 1 would also be adjusted only once to correspond with the final minimum gauge size that's implemented in year 5. And those are the same vent sizes as proposed in options B and C. And then finally, option E is our alternative approach that, instead of using a trigger mechanism, would establish a schedule for changes to the minimum gauge size in Area 1 only. So under this option, the first step increases the minimum gauge size in Area 1 by 1/16 of an inch to 3 5/16 of an inch for the 2023 fishing year. And then 2 years later, the final adjustments would be that the minimum gauge size in Area 1 would be increased to 3 3/8 of an inch, and the vent sizes would also be adjusted corresponding to that final gauge size for the 2025 fishing year. And all in this option, all of the measures in Area 3 and Outer Cape Cod would stay status quo. So under any of these proposed options under issue 2, the measures that are implemented for LCMA 3 would apply to all Area 3 permit holders, including those that fish in the southern New England stock. And the PDT recommended this as opposed to applying the measures only to the Gulf of Maine or Georges Bank portion of the stock for a couple of reasons. First, dividing up LCMA 3 into stock-specific areas would create a significant administrative burden, and it would further complicate enforcement. And additionally, when previous addenda for lobster implemented measures to address the southern New England stock decline, those measures were also applied throughout Area 3, including the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank portion. So the PDT felt this was consistent with previous management actions. So that concludes my review of the proposed options, and I'll quickly just go over the board's task for today and the next steps. So today the board's considering draft addendum 27 for public comment. So first, the board has the option to make any desired modifications to the management options, and then it may consider approving the document for comment. And if the board approves the document for public comment today, the next steps are to finalize and publish the addendum for public comment and get a schedule of public hearings together in the next month or so. And then in March, we could start conducting state public hearings, then convene the advisory panel for their feedback. And finally, the board could consider the addendum for final approval at its May meeting. And with that, I am happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Caitlin. Great job summarizing a lot of complexity there. So thank you for that. Okay, let's start off with questions for Caitlin on the addendum. Just a couple of quick notes. So as folks raise their virtual hands, if you would allow me, I'll put them down just so I can keep track of who I called on, and I think it'll go a little smoother that way. So I will go ahead and put your hands down for you. And just a quick apology, my office window is about 5 feet from I-95, so there's a lot of custom exhausts out there, which is pretty cool, except not when you're trying to run a meeting. So apologies preemptively if you hear any traffic noise. Okay, with that, let's get some questions on the board here for Caitlin. So go ahead and raise your hand if you have any questions. Okay, go ahead, Mike Louise.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Caitlin, for your presentation. Can you go back just a couple slides to option E for me, please? Okay, I just want to make sure I'm clear, and I have a question. So for option E here, there is no, did you say that there's no trigger that would require these changes, that these changes would happen just over the course of time as a mechanism for increasing the spawning stock without any trigger?
That's correct. There's no trigger mechanism for this one.
Okay. So what was the plan development team's rationale, if you can enlighten me, on maintaining status quo for LCMA 3 and the outer Cape Cod area? The reason I ask is that all the other options include some form of a maximum or some change in those areas. Was there particular rationale on this option for why everything outside of LCMA 1 was just maintaining status quo?
Yes, I can take a stab at it. So the technical committee's analysis that looked at the gauge size changes and the impacts they would have on the stock showed that the impacts of changing the minimum size in LCMA 1 was definitely the greatest relative change to SSB. So with the changes to LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod, you see a much smaller impact on SSB. So the PDT felt that it would be appropriate to include an option where those don't change and LCMA 1 does. I think generally they wanted to kind of provide another alternative. There was some disagreement between PDT members about, how much changing the maximum size in LCMA 3 and Outer Cape Cod would really do. So some folks wanted to include an option where there was not recommended changes for those areas.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you, Caitlin.
All right, thanks for that. Next up, I have Dan Mckiernan. Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, thanks. If I could follow up to Caitlin's comments for Mike Louise's edification, it would be that, at least in my mind, one of the reasons that was proposed, I think, is that during the Southern New England conservation measures over the last, let's say 10 years, which included a gauge increase for Area 3, but also trap reductions, those were applied to all vessels in Area 3, regardless if they were fishing primarily in the Georges Bank, Gulf of Mainstock, or Southern New England. And so I think that was part of the rationale for leaving Area 3 slightly harmless in terms of some of the conservation measures.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dan. All right, any other questions for Caitlin before we move into board discussion? Dave Borden, go ahead, Dave.
Can you hear me, Jason?
Yep, we gotcha.
Okay, so I guess my question is on the organization of the options and how we can mix and match these options after the hearings. I can envision a couple of scenarios, and I can give you examples if needed, where when we come back from public hearing, elements of the industry, either Area 1 or possibly Area 3 of the Outer Cape, are going to recommend a different arrangement of options, and I want to make sure that we all have the same interpretation of what of the options and flexibility that we have to rearrange these things. So just so I'm clear, for instance, I could see a scenario where we come back and some elements of the industry want to pick option 3, which is 20% trigger and 30% trigger, but then combine that with a portion of option D, which doesn't recommend those triggers. It's only talking about 17%. And the same thing also would apply. A second example would be, I think we may have differences of opinion after the hearings on a maximum size. So to me, there's a range of maximum sizes in the document that goes from status quo to 6.5 down to 6 1/4 and 6 inches. So I just want to make sure that all of us have the same interpretation that I do, that we can resort these options as long as it's an option that's been analyzed and put them into a package at the end of time. If somebody disagrees with that, I would hope they'd speak up and then we can discuss it further. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thanks for bringing that issue up. So first, I'll look to Caitlin to see if you agree with, how David sort of proposed that these things can be mixed and matched to some degree. And then if other board members have comments after Caitlin speaks, I'd be interested to hear from you as well. So Caitlin, any response to what David offered?
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I believe that David is correct. There could be some mixing and matching of these options after public hearings. So just to kind of outline the boundaries, I guess, as I see them, for option B, you have a 17% decline. That's the lowest level of decline that's used as a trigger level. So I think that would be your most conservative trigger level, and then your most, or opposite of that, would be your 32% decline. That's the greatest. So those are, I believe, the boundaries on trigger levels. And then for the minimum and maximum gauge size changes, I think what David said is also correct, that the minimum gauge size, the most change that you see in any of these options would be 3 3/8 of an inch for Area 1. And then for maximum gauge size, I think 6 is the lowest maximum gauge size. So that would be where you could, as low as you could go for maximum size when you're mixing and matching. And then I think to respond to the question about changing the trigger level for this type of setup with the incremental changes, yeah, I think as long as that trigger level is within what was analyzed, so 17% to 32%, then I think it's appropriate.
Awesome. Thank you, Caitlin. I see Dan Mckiernan has his hand raised. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Caitlin, if I could ask for clarification, it seems to me that option E is actually the least or the most extreme measure in terms of triggers, because there's no trigger at all. So option E actually kicks in those changes without any trigger being met, and then next in the degree of or the spectrum would be 17, and then it would be 20, et cetera. And I'm glad David Borden brought this up, because I think it's important for us as a board to be comfortable with some kind of hybridization, final motions coming out of the public hearings come May, when we try to settle this. And I know that in a related issue, this is kind of being debated at the executive committee about some black sea bass issues concerning appeals. And I think one of the issues that was raised by some of the members of the executive committee as to whether or not it's appropriate for the board to create these kind of hybrid outcomes either before or after an appeal. And so I'm comfortable with, as David's described, having an outcome this May where we could mix and match these, because all of these to some degree have a conservation basis. It's just there's different bins here, or different mechanisms that we're looking at enacting. So I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, Dan. So super important point. So maybe just to kind of call it out overtly, and maybe look to Caitlin or Tony to offer comment. Between David and Dan's comments, I think what they were both implying is you could end up in the end with a motion come May that kind of mixes these things. So the motion wouldn't have been explicitly one of these options, but might contain different elements of various options within them. And so far, David and Dan have expressed comfort with that potential outcome. Dan raised the notion that, this is sort of a larger discussion going on at the commission. So I wonder, Caitlin or Tony, are you comfortable with that interpretation given these other things that are kind of going on at the higher commission level?
Mr. Chair, I'm going to go ahead and defer to Tony on this one.
Thanks, Caitlin. As long as there is a comfort level at the board and there hasn't been any decisions made by the commission that would impact, I think, how you have laid this out, it works for me. I'll let Bob speak up if he feels any differently. I will say that Pat Kelleher also raised his hand while I was talking, so he may have an interpretation as well.
Okay, quick to Bob, if you wanted to offer anything first, and then I'll go to Pat.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, not a lot to add. I think, the practice at the commission has been to allow any option to be selected in the final decision on a addendum or amendment or a new FMP that's within the range, that's what the term we've been using, within the range of alternatives that have been taken out for public hearing. So there's been multiple instances where we've kind of mixed and matched, picked one trigger level from column A and the management measures from column B, and you merge those together, maybe in this example. So I think, it is within the bounds of what we've been doing historically. And relative to Dan's comments and your comments regarding the appeals discussion and what's fair and what's not to be appealed and what should be used there, I think that is a discussion that's still unfolding and will take place tomorrow morning. But I think part of that has to do with really not changing our process as far as approving documents. It may impact down the road, if we take something out that following an appeal, if something needs to be modified, then what happens? You know, is there more public comment? Is there, you know, are additional hybrid options fair game for resolving an appeal and those sorts of questions? So I think in this instance, if the board is comfortable with it, and I think we can make mention of that during public hearings, that there may be a hybridization of these different options, then I think we're all set.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob. Appreciate that. And I'll pass it over to you, Pat. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bob touched on it right at the very end regarding making sure that we're clear with the public during public hearings that the potential of a hybridization approach could be made. I think that's going to be really important within the presentation. I also just want to flag, I'm looking at option E on the screen now, which would be the 2023 fishing year. And I'm not sure if the PDT and staff have considered this, but if you're going to need new gauges, the idea that they're going to potentially be ready for a January 2023 fishing year, if it's going to go in a calendar year, it may be very difficult to actually have gauges ready and made by that time. We've talked to one of the manufacturers, and the lead time is fairly significant. So I just do want to flag that. Not to mention that some states, including Maine right now, would have to go through the legislature to have any final changes to minimum and maximum. So again, want to flag that as well.
If I could respond here.
Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Pat, for bringing that up. I think the timeline on this is definitely something the board could modify either now or at final action. So this is kind of a template that the PDT put forward in terms of the soonest they thought it could be put into place, but recognizing that the board may have some preferences for changing those implementation years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jason, just to follow up and it's a question to Caitlin, I guess. Caitlin, it would be for the fishing year in 2023, correct? And so that doesn't start until early summer.
Correct.
May. So it'd be May 1, not January 1.
Is that right, Caitlin?
Sorry, yes, that's correct. It's meant for the fishing year.
Okay, so that buys a couple of extra months there. Okay, so it's an important consideration, those sort of logistical elements, and we can, you know, if somebody feels comfortable enough thinking through that now, they can make comment on that during our deliberations here, or we could hold off and make adjustments when we're taking final action. So thanks for that, Pat. Dan Mckiernan, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, Caitlin, would it be valuable for the board to hear from you about a forecast of when the technical committee turns the crank and sort of reveals the level of the index's relative reduction? So, and I think that's kind of embedded in some of these proposals, is that the TC is going to get together, I believe, late this summer, and are going to probably announce, kind of like the Maryland, you know, Young of the Year index comes out and everybody gets all jiggled up. So the technical committee is going to combine all those data sets, and they're going to reveal a number. And I think, you know, if a plan like this gets enacted, then that gives you sort of the lead time. So could you reveal that or talk about that in a little bit of detail?
Sure, thanks, Dan. So my understanding is that this index could be updated by August each year. There's a chance that it could be earlier, depending on if states are able to get those data finalized from their surveys for the previous year. So I do believe that the intention is to have that data available by August.
Thanks, Caitlin. Sound okay, Dan?
Yes, thank you.
And I'll just add that if Kathleen, RTC chair, feels differently, to please speak up. But I think that's what I recall from our discussions.
Yeah, go ahead, Kathleen.
I think that we actually talked that this could be available sooner than that. But it depends on when data can be chugged. And so each state agency has a different schedule for that. But I thought that the conversation was more March, April. And it's really landings that is the problem that pushes it out till August. So for these indices, I think that this data could be available sooner, but we have not talked about a specific deadline within the technical committee.
Okay, thanks for that, Kathleen. All right, any remaining questions from the board before we start to move into comments and deliberation? All right, seeing no hands, we'll move into comments now. So, now would be the time to offer any adjustments, any modifications, anything of that nature, which we could then vote on to modify the addendum. So anyone with comments on the addendum from the board? David Borden, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just make the quick suggestion that all of these management options, we've got two different sections where we've got management options, and there should be a sentence that's very clear in each one of them that says something like, under any of these options that follow, state jurisdictions have the right to adopt more conservative regulations. I know that's the intent, but we want the public to understand that they have that right to be more conservative. And I just point out the main maximum size is more conservative, and there probably is going to be industry representatives that want to maintain that. So add a few sentences, please.
Okay, thanks for that, David. So looking to add sort of a caveat about the ability for a jurisdiction to be more conservative than set up in the FMP. Caitlin, I'll just ask the question, is the comment okay to stand on its own, or do we need a motion to sort of codify that?
I don't believe we need a motion, Mr. Chair, but I guess, wanted some clarification, because the way that these options are set up, we've recommended LCMA specific changes for the gauge sizes. And so I don't think it's the intention of, please just clarify this if I'm not reading your question correctly, but I don't think it was the intention to implement something outside of what was recommended for each of these LCMA specific gauge sizes.
David, care to respond to that?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I'm just thinking of this doesn't apply to well, actually it does apply to Area 3, but it probably is more appropriate to Area 1. You've got a maximum size that's at 5 inches. Area 3 has regulations that are more conservative. We want, if there are jurisdictions on the board that want to have more conservative regulations, they should have the right to do it. That's what all I'm saying.
Okay, thanks,
Okay.
Dave.
I think I'm clear on that. And I believe we can add a sentence, but I believe that's, unless you state otherwise, that is the way our FMPs usually work. So we can make that clear.
Right, yeah, I think it makes sense to sort of offer it explicitly, and then particular as the public is looking at the information, they kind of understand that as well. Thanks for that.
And Jason, I just want to clarify really quick. It's that a state would do that. It wouldn't be something that is applied to an entire LCMA. It would be applied via the state. And so it would then be a landing provision because it wouldn't be a provision of the commission.
Good point. I was assuming David meant state as well, but maybe that doesn't make sense for some of the areas. So David, does that make sense to you?
That was exactly the context I was thinking of it. A state would have a right to be more restrictive.
Okay. Great, thank you. Okay, other hands for comments on the addendum? I am not, oh, there we go. Thank you, Dan. Go ahead. Dan Mckiernan.
Thank you. I just want to say that I tracked the progress of this document by listening in to both the technical committee discussions and the plan development team, and so I want to commend them for the work, and especially how this is laid out in the final analysis. I think it's really clear. So I would move to approve addendum 27 for public comment as drafted.
Okay, we'll give a minute to get that up on the board. Thanks for the motion, Dan.
You can take out today, Maya.
Yeah, I don't think we've just decided we don't need to do anything with David's recommended language, except that it'll be inserted by consensus. So maybe we can say as modified today or as drafted. It's up to you, Jay.
Yeah, just to make sure, to be a little perhaps persnickety here, maybe let's have that added, if it's okay with you, to the motion as amended today.
That works for me. Thank you.
Great. So we have a motion on the board from Dan Mckiernan. Is there a second? Let's see. I see Pat Keller is second. Actually, I should check. Pat, was your hand up to second the motion?
Yeah, I second the motion.
Great. Thank you for that. All right. We have a motion on the board. It's been seconded. I'll go to you first. Dan, anything in addition you'd like to offer on behalf of your motion?
No, I think I stated it pretty clearly. I was really pleased with the efforts by both of those teams to produce the document we have in front of us today.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And over to Pat. Anything to add on to what Dan offered?
I just want to mirror Dan's comments. Great job by staff, PDT, and technical committee.
Excellent. Very good. So let me go to the rest of the board now. Are there any comments from other board members? I've got one hand up, so I'll call on Patrice Mckiernan. Go ahead, Patrice.
There it is. Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't sure if you were taking comments from the public. I just wanted to weigh in as an industry member, and I'm sure the board is well aware of this, but this addendum is going to come as a huge shock to the lobster industry, the Maine lobster industry in particular. I think, as everybody knows, we're coping with massive amounts of changes, big cuts due to the whale regulations. So my question to the board is, have you considered potentially waiting to see what the next round of whale regulations and cuts associated with those are going to be? I would assume we're going to see some significant effort reductions, which could actually contribute significantly to the goals of this addendum. So curious about that. And then if this does move forward, I would just say in terms of the public hearing schedule, you're gonna need to do a lot. Holding a couple of online webinars is not gonna cut it. People are gonna be really shocked, really upset. Fishermen are gonna wanna weigh in, and it's gonna be very difficult in this COVID environment. So that would be really important to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrice. Appreciate your comments. Maybe to venture a response to your initial question, and Caitlin can help me out if I'm off on this, but I think certainly all of the board members, are aware of all of the things going on with this fishery, with this industry right now. I think the intent at this point is to move the addendum forward so that the public gets a chance to weigh in on it, and kind of synthesizing this this document in amongst all of the other things going on in the fishery can occur. Nothing would be finalized at the earliest until May, as laid out in Caitlin's timeline. So I think there's time to sort of process, what interactions there may be between this document and anything else going on. But the intent here today, I think, is to finalize this document and move it out for the public to get a crack at it. So Caitlin, does that sound right to you?
Yes, I'm in agreement with everything you said.
Great, thanks for that. Thank you, Patrice. And yeah, so there weren't other hands from the board, so any of the public wishing to make a comment, please raise your virtual hand and I'll call on. All right, not seeing, hopefully I've given enough time, it felt like enough time for folks to find their hand and raise it. I'm not seeing any hands. So we have a motion on the board. It's been seconded. One more chance for the board to offer any remaining comments. Please raise your hand. Not seeing any. Why don't we take, I think since there's not a lot of hands going up, I'm pretty sure folks are pretty comfortable, but why don't we take 2 minutes here to caucus, and then we'll go ahead and call the vote. Are you able to, Maya, put that little timer up, or whoever does that, so we can kind of keep track? We'll do 2 minutes. Oh, I can, I got my computer clock here. Oh, there we go. Excellent. All right, 2 minutes to caucus, and then we'll come back to the board. Okay, our 2 minutes are up. Does anybody need any additional time? Please raise your hand. Okay, not seeing any hands. So why don't we go ahead and call the vote. Actually, first I'll check with Tony or Caitlin. Feeling that there wouldn't be, seems like folks are pretty much on board with this. So I was wondering if I can just call for objections, or is this one we need to do a full vote on?
You can just call for objections if you'd like to, Mr. Chair. It's fine.
Okay, thanks for that. All right, and with that, are there any objections to the motion on the board? Seeing no hands, we will consider the motion approved by consent. Thanks, everybody. So, go ahead, Pat, I see your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just, Patrice brought up a really critical point, and I just want to make sure it's clear on the record that we know from a department perspective what kind of response we're likely to get from this, considering everything else that's going on within the whale world, not understanding, if there's going to be any potential court intervention as we get into the early summer. So the department is planning on holding extensive outreach on this particular addendum. Obviously, the coronavirus and its impacts are going to weigh heavily on in-person versus webinars, but we're going to do our best, depending on the status of the virus, to be able to try to at least have some in-person webinars. And then I think, at least from my perspective, I'm certainly not going to speak for the rest of the board, if we were to see major changes coming forward from a whale perspective, as you say, on effort or other things that would have an impact directly related to what the intent of this addendum is. I, for one, would want to make sure that this board make sure we address that before we make any major changes or make further changes in the future. So just want to make sure that was clear on the record from the state of Maine's perspective.
Thank you for that, Pat. Appreciate it. Okay. Thanks, everybody. That went pretty smoothly, so I appreciate that. With that, I think we can move on to our next agenda item. This one is to consider terms of reference for the Jonah crab benchmark stock assessment. So with that, Jeff, if you're out there in radio land, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Kipp, the Commission Science staff working on Jonah crab. And as the chairman mentioned, I'll be going over terms of reference and a timeline for the 2023 Jonah crab stock assessment. A memo for this agenda item was included with meeting materials, and the memo included 3 components. The first component is the terms of reference for the Jonah crab assessment. These are the TORs to be addressed by the TC and SAS during the stock assessment, which I'll present here in a slightly abbreviated format. The second component is the terms of reference for the Jonah crab peer review. These are TORs to be addressed by the peer review panel that reviews the stock assessment upon completion by the TC and SAS. These are essentially the same as stock assessment TORs, but directing the review panel to evaluate the TC and SAS's fulfillment of the stock assessment TORs. So for the sake of time, I won't cover these in the presentation. And then the final component in the memo is the timeline of the assessment. I'll present this timeline with select milestones of interest to the board following the stock assessment TORs. And the objective of this agenda item is to consider the TORs and timeline for approval so that TC and SAS can initiate the stock assessment. So for the first stock assessment TOR, TOR1 is to characterize precision and accuracy of fishery dependent and fishery independent data used in the assessment. TOR2 is to discuss the effects of data strengths and weaknesses on model inputs and outputs. TOR3 is to develop simple empirical indicators of stock abundance, stock characteristics, and fishery characteristics that can be monitored annually between stock assessments. TOR4 is to develop models used to estimate population parameters and biological reference points and analyze model performance. TOR5 is to state assumptions made for all models and explain the likely effects of assumption violations on synthesis of input data and model outputs. TOR6 is to characterize uncertainty of model estimates and biological or empirical reference points. TOR7 is to recommend stock status as related to reference points. TOR8 deals with other potential scientific issues to be explored in the assessment. And these include compare reference points derived in this assessment with what is known about the general life history of the exploited stock, explain any inconsistencies. And a second sub-bullet of this TOR is to explore, identify, describe, and if possible, quantify environmental climatic drivers. TOR9 is dealing with minority reports. If a minority report has been filed, explain majority reasoning against adopting approach suggested in that report. TOR10 is to develop detailed short and long-term prioritized lists of recommendations for future research, data collection, and assessment methodology. Highlight improvements to be made by next benchmark review. And our last TOR for the stock assessment is to recommend timing of next benchmark assessment and intermediate updates if necessary. For the assessment timeline, we will be requesting data by the end of April of this year, and we will have a 2021 terminal year for the stock assessment. We'll have 4 workshops throughout the process, a data workshop focused on continued evaluation of the available data sets, a methods workshop focused on analyses and modeling approaches to be pursued during the stock assessment, an assessment workshop where the SAS will convene to review results of the assessment analyses, and then a peer review workshop to have the assessment reviewed by an external peer review panel. We will provide updates on the stock assessment progress at each ASMFC quarterly meeting throughout the assessment process. And then we anticipate presenting the assessment and peer review for management consideration at the 2023 ASMFC annual meeting. And that concludes my presentation. I can answer any questions the board has about the Jonah crab assessment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. Questions for Jeff on the terms of reference or the timeline for the Jonah crab assessment? Please raise your hand. I'll give folks a minute to think, and if you don't mind, Jeff, can you flip back to TOR4? So I wonder, I was wondering as I was reading this one, you have developed models used to estimate population parameters and biological reference points. Kind of wondering about that in the context of, you know, what likely will be some data limited modeling approaches for this stock. And do you think the analysis team has enough flexibility here? Like, you might not be able to produce a biological reference point with some data limited techniques more geared towards producing catch advice. Do you think you have enough flexibility in here for that situation?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I think we kind of left it open in a later TOR when we mentioned characterizing uncertainty about biological or empirical reference points. So still to be determined whether we'll be able to come up with biological reference points and whether they'll be appropriate for Jonah crab, which is an issue we've run into for lobster and lobster assessments. But if we do find that we need to come up with empirical ad hoc type reference points, I think we will default to those type reference points in place of biological reference points.
Okay, good. And I suppose, right, the team could always just sort of answer the TOR by saying we couldn't using this approach, and that's a fair response as long as it's justified. So appreciate that. Great. Looking up at the board, any board members with questions, comments on the timeline or any of the terms of reference? Not seeing any. Is there any members of the public? Oh, sorry. Give me one more minute. I'll come back to the public. Go ahead, Dan Mckiernan.
No, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I was going to make a motion, but I'll let you go to the public.
Okay, yeah. Give me one more minute. But I'll know to go right to you, Dan. So, anyone from the public wishing to make comments on the terms of reference or the timeline? Okay. Not seeing any hands. Back to you, Dan. Would you like to get a motion on the table?
Yes, I would. I'd like to move to approve the terms of reference and the timeline for the Jonah crab benchmark stock assessment.
Okay. Thank you for that, Dan. Got a motion on the board. Do I have a second? I saw Emerson Hasbrook's hand first. So Emerson, you get the second, assuming that's why you're raising your hand.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'll second that motion.
Excellent. Thank you, Emerson. All right. So we've got a motion on the board to approve the terms of reference for the Jonah crab benchmark stock assessment. I think implicit in that is, comfort with the timeline as well, unless, Jeff, you think you need something explicit for the timeline?
No, Mr. Chairman, I think that does it.
Okay. All right. So why don't we go ahead and do another, I think this will be another short caucus, but let's do a caucus nonetheless. I'll give everyone 2 minutes to caucus, and then we'll come back and take the vote. So 2 minutes, please, Maya. Thank you. Okay, I hope everyone had enough time to caucus. Anybody need a little more time? Please raise your hand. Okay. So with this one, again, I think we can just look for any objection rather than going through a full vote. So are there any objections to approving the motion? Please raise your hand. Okay, seeing no hands, we will consider the motion approved by consent. Thank you all very much for that. And thank you, Jeff. Pretty excited to see the Jonah crab assessment get underway. I think the team on that one is really strong. And I think, you know, it's such a unique species and an important fishery. So it'll be great to see that, that assessment get underway. So thanks for that, Jeff. Okay, moving on. We will now go to considering the fishery management plan reviews for American lobster and Jonah crab for the 2020 fishing year. Caitlin, I will pass it over to you for a presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me get my screen up here. All right. This is the wrong presentation. All right, hold on one moment. Okay. I think we've got it this time. All right, thanks, Mr. Chair. So I was planning to start off with lobster and then go directly into Jonah crab and take questions at the end, if that's all right with you.
That sounds perfect, Caitlin. Thank you.
All right, great. So starting off with lobster for a quick refresher on stock status. This is the reference abundance curve for the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock from the 2020 assessment. The stock status was determined based on the 2016 to 2018 average abundance, which is represented by that black dot at the top. And based on the recommended reference points, the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock is not depleted and overfishing is not occurring. And then for S&E, we have a bit of a different picture from the 2020 assessment. The stock status for Southern New England is significantly depleted with abundance near all-time lows. However, according to the exploitation reference points, the Southern New England stock is not experiencing overfishing. For commercial landings, for lobster, we've seen a substantial increase over the last 40 years with the all-time high occurring in 2016 near 160 million pounds. And landings have decreased a bit since then. And in 2020, the coastwide commercial landings were 121.9 million pounds, which is a 4% decrease from 2019 landings of 127.4 million pounds. And the largest contributors to the 2020 fishery were Maine, which is shown by the red line, and Massachusetts, shown by the yellow line, with 80% and 14% of the coastwide landings, respectively. And the ex-vessel value for all lobster landings in 2020 was $529 million. So for recent management actions affecting state requirements, Addendum 26 required harvest data to be reported at the 10-minute square level, and that went into effect January 1st, 2021. And the states are required to implement 100% harvester reporting by 2023. And then Addendum 18, which was approved in 2012, established a series of trap reductions in LCMAs 2 and 3 with the intent of scaling the size of the S&E fishery to the size of the resource. And these trap reductions included a 25% reduction in year 1, followed by a series of 5% reductions for 5 years for LCMA 2, and then for LCMA 3, a series of 5% reductions over 5 years. And I just wanted to note that the 5th and final year of reductions for LCMA 3 took place at the end of the 2019 fishing year and affected the trap allocations for the 2020 fishery. And the last year of reductions for LCMA 2 took place at the end of the 2020 fishing year and affect the trap allocations for 2021. So COVID-19 affected several of our regular surveys for lobster in 2020. So instead of presenting on the trends, I just want to quickly highlight those surveys that were impacted by COVID. 4 surveys were not completed due to COVID-19, including the spring, May, New Hampshire trawl survey, the spring and fall Massachusetts trawl surveys, the spring and fall Long Island Sound trawl surveys, and the New Jersey Ocean trawl surveys. The plan review team noted a few minor issues in their review of the state compliance reports for lobster. In particular, in 2020, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Connecticut did not complete the required 10 fishery-dependent monitoring sea or port sampling trips. Rhode Island completed 9 out of 10 sampling trips and no sea sampling trips. And then at-sea observer trips were suspended in New Jersey for 2020 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And no fishery-dependent sampling has been conducted by Connecticut since 2014 due to reductions in funding and staffing levels. Other than this, all states appear to be in compliance with the requirements of the FMP. For de minimis requests, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia have requested continued de minimis status, and all 3 states qualify with their most recent 2-year average of commercial landings being under 40,000 pounds. This final slide summarizes the PRT's additional recommendations. So first, the PRT recommends that the board review the monitoring requirements for the Southern New England stock, given that stock status is depleted and the difficulty of obtaining sea sampling trips, as well as a need for sampling in federal waters. The PRT also recommends the TC discuss how to present the state index information in the annual compliance reports to give a more detailed resolution of adult and juvenile abundance and size composition of the stock. And then lastly, the board, the recommendation is that the board engage with the Committee on Economic and Social Sciences to consider what socioeconomic data are available to develop metrics that could be used to characterize changes in the fishery. And so next I'll go into the Jonah crab FMP review for 2020 fishing year. So in 2020, landings for Jonah crab along the Atlantic coast totaled approximately 13.5 million pounds, which is about a 15% decrease from the 2019 total of 16 million pounds. And the ex-vessel value of Jonah crab landings in 2020 was 11.2 million, which is about a 14% decrease from 2019. And the states of Massachusetts and Rhode Island were the largest contributors to landings, once again, with 61% and 24% respectively. The status of the stock for Jonah crab, as we just discussed, is unknown, and there is not a coastwide stock assessment. However, today the board approved those TORs, so we will have that assessment underway, and it should be completed in fall 2023. Jonah crab are surveyed using many of the same surveys as lobster. So those surveys that I listed for lobster that were impacted by COVID-19 were also impacted for Jonah crab. And then in addition, there is the spring and fall Northeast Fishery Science Center bottom trawl survey, which was not conducted in 2020. For state compliance, the PRT noted that New York has not implemented all of the required measures in the FMP. So to date, New York has not implemented regulations to limit the directed trap fishery to lobster permit holders only, and the 1,000 crab bycatch limit for trap, non-lobster trap and non-trap gear. And this has been brought up for several years. New York has previously indicated that they're unsure how long it will take to get this legislation revised to implement the provisions. But in practice, the fishery is already operating with these conditions. And then just another note, the PRT has noted that Massachusetts has been unable to meet the compliance report deadline for the past 3 years. And I apologize for the street noise. Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia have also requested de minimis status for Jonah crab, and they meet the requirements with their average commercial landings constituting less than 1% of the average coastwide commercial catch for the last 3 years. The PRT recommends approving these requests, and with those de minimis status, these states are exempt from fishery independent and dependent sampling requirements. So these are the PRT's additional recommendations for the FMP review for Jonah crab. So first, they once again noted the concern about the lack of Jonah crab regulations in New York. They also recommended that jurisdictions with crab-only harvesters should report on the number and collective effort of those participants. And finally, they would like the Law Enforcement Committee to review compliance in the Jonah crab fishery, given it is relatively new and there might be some things to learn there. For lobster and Jonah crab FMP reviews today, the board can consider approval of each document along with the state compliance reports and the de minimis requests for Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. So that is all I have, and I can take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Caitlin. So let's start off with questions, and I think we'll sort of address the two fisheries separately with motions, if that's okay. So first, questions for Caitlin. Please raise your hand. And these questions could be for either Jonah crab or lobster. Okay, not seeing any hands. Let's move to taking comments or any motions. Let's start with the lobster FMP compliance. So any comments or motions for lobster? I see Dan Mckiernan, you had your hand up first. Go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify, Massachusetts failure to provide compliance reports on time, I'll confess that for the last 3 years, we have been, actually the last 2 years, suffering from the combination of COVID-related, people out, CARES-related work where we tasked our statistics program staff to devise some pretty intense analyses about permit holders' eligibility in order to give out the CARES funds. And then finally, the litigation that we're involved in that went to trial over the summer of last year did take priority. But I do expect those reports will be more timely in the future.
Thanks for that, Dan. Appreciate it. Next up, I have Emerson Hasbrook. Go ahead, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was ready to make a motion for lobsters. The staff have a motion prepared for lobster FMP review. Fishery management plan reviews.
Looks like they do.
So I move to approve fishery management plan reviews, state compliance reports, and de minimis requests for American lobster for the 2020 fishing year.
Okay, thank you for that, Emerson. Motion made by Emerson. Is there a second? Colleen, I see your hand is up. Is that to make a second?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to second the motion.
Great, thank you, Colleen. Seconded by Colleen Buffani. The name went away and I forgot. Buffard. Thank you. Sorry, Colleen. So we've got a motion on the board, a second. Emerson, do you wish to speak to your motion?
No, I don't have anything to add in addition to what was in the review. I think we're pretty well set on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. Colleen, anything to add?
Nope, I just thank the plan review team for their work. I know it's a lot of information to sift through, and great job at the meeting this morning, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Great. I had a hand up for a minute there, but it is going away. Hey, there it is. Sherry, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question. Maybe Caitlin can help me with this. Is the state of New York non-compliance would that be with this motion or would that be with the Jonah Crab motion?
I believe this motion is specific to lobster. So I think a separate motion would need to be made regarding Jonah crab.
Right, that's why I split them up, Sherry.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Jason, can I just ask Caitlin to read the states that are de minimis and have Maya include those states in the motion themselves, and then before you vote, read it, just so we have those states on record.
Nope, that sounds perfect, as long as it's okay with Emerson and Colleen.
So the states are Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia.
That's fine with me.
Me as well.
Great, great. Thank you all for that. Good modification there. Okay, so we have a motion on the board that approves the fishery management plan review and approves the de minimis requests for American lobster. Why don't we just take a real quick moment to caucus. So let's just do 1 minute, but I want to make sure, just in case people have time to connect with their teammates. So 1 minute, please, for a caucus. Thank you. Okay, minute is up. Hopefully you've had enough time to caucus. So with that, let's call the question, and maybe I'll try one more time unless Tony jumps in. Are there any objections to the motion that's on the board? Please raise your hand. Okay, seeing no hands, we will accept this motion as approved by consent. All right, let's move on now to Jonah crab. Anyone wishing to make a motion or comments on Jonah crab? I see Pat Kelleher. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had a chance to talk to Jim Gilmore in New York this morning regarding the compliance issue with Jonah crab. It's clear that the state of New York has done their very best to make changes through their legislative process. But in this case, the legislature has, even though they've got through their committee work, they were not able to get a final vote. And in discussing this with Jim, he indicated that it may be beneficial to have the weight of the commission behind him. And so I have a motion prepared, and staff has that if they'd like to put it up. And before I read this lengthy motion into the record, I would just say that my plan is, if we get a second on this, is to actually table this motion to the August meeting, so New York has the ability to point towards this potential action later in the summer. So with that, I would move that the American Lobster Board recommends to the ISFMP Policy Board that the state of New York be found out of compliance for not fully and effectively implementing and enforcing Section 5.1 Commercial Fisheries Management Measures of the Fisheries Management Plan for Jonah crab in sections 3.1 and 3.2 of Addendum 1 to the FMP. The state of New York must implement regulations to limit participation in the directed trap fishery to only those vessels and permit holders that already hold a lobster permit or can prove prior participation in the crab fishery before the control date of June 2nd, 2015. The state of New York must also implement the incidental bycatch limit of 1,000 crabs per trip for the non-trap gear and non-lobster trap gear. The implementation of these measures is necessary to achieve the goals and objectives of the FMP and ensure that the conservation of the species by preventing increased participation in landings in the fishery.
All right. Thank you for that, Pat. So we've got a motion by Pat. Do I have a second? I saw David Borden's hand first. David, was that hand up for a second?
Yes.
Great, thank you, David. So we've got a motion on the board with a second. Pat, that was you already sort of gave a pretty good lead in there. Did you want to add anything else?
I don't want to add anything else, but it might be good to hear from the state of New York so it's clear on the record.
Yep, I see Jim's hand up as well. Jim, hang on one second. Just want to check in with Dave Borden. David, anything on the motion before I go to Jim?
Nothing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And so, Jim, you are free to make any comments.
Okay, just to check, can you hear me okay? Because we have some new equipment here.
I can hear you, Jim.
Okay. Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman and Pat. Just what I'll add is just simply an update on where we are and what we've done. And Pat explained it pretty well, but we did last year and several years prior to this, but last year, before the legislature in New York for the 2021 session, did bring it up. Senator Kaminsky did bring a bill forward that passed in the Senate, but for reasons unknown to us, the Assembly failed to adopt it. We did notify the legislature again at the beginning of the 22 session a couple of weeks ago, and the Senate will take it up again, and the Assembly leadership, we've talked with them and they understand it a little bit better now. And they've agreed to implement it this year. But again, through this, we believe it would be completed if they follow through on this, by the summer of 2022. So at this point, we completely understand the non-compliance motion because we've been trying to get the legislature to work on it. And again, they have committed to it, but I think it will be probably helpful to hear from the commission's full body on it. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Jim. Appreciate that. Hopefully this helps you make that case. So we've got a motion on the board that's been seconded. I'll give one more shot to the board. Go ahead, Pat.
If there are no more comments on the motion, Mr. Chairman, I would move to table until our August 2022 meeting.
Okay, I did not see any other hands, so there is a motion to table this until the August meeting. I'm assuming I need a second there, Tony.
Correct, Jason.
Okay, looking for a second to the motion to table. Cherie, I see your hand raised. Is that for a second?
Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you, Cherie. So now we have a motion to table until the August 2022 meeting. Motion made by Pat Kelleher, seconded by Cherie Patterson. Tony, am I okay to look for objection to the motion to table, or do I need to call a vote?
I think you're okay of looking for an objection. I think that when you're going to a meeting that is not within this meeting, the correct Robert's rule word would be move to postpone, though, if that is okay with Pat and Cherie.
Certainly would be all right with me. Yeah, that's a good correction. Thank you.
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, quick modification. Move to postpone until the August 2022 meeting. Motion made by Mr. Kelleher, seconded by Ms. Patterson. I'm going to go ahead and we're starting to get past our time here, so I'm going to go ahead and ask for any objections to the motion to postpone until August 2022. Seeing no hands, we will call this motion approved by consent. Thanks for that. I think we still need a motion, a full motion for Jonah crab. Is that correct, Caitlin?
Correct, to approve the FMP review and compliance reports and de minimis requests.
Okay, so we're looking for a final motion here to approve the Jonah crab FMP and the de minimis requests. Anybody wish to make that motion? Cherie, thank you for that, Cherie. Get that up on the board. Do we want to add the states in again here for the de minimis requests?
Yes, they're the same states, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia.
So motion made by Cherie Patterson. Do I have a second? Still not seeing a second. Hey, there we go. Roy Miller for the second. Thank you, Roy. Any discussion from the board on this motion? Please raise your hand. Okay, seeing no hands, I'm gonna be bold here and go right to the question. Does anybody object to the motion that is on the board? Please raise your hand. Seeing no hands, we will call that motion approved by consent. Kind of clipping along here, and I see there is a question from a board member. So Tom, I'm not sure if it's like a technical question or related to Jonah crab, but if you want to raise that now, please feel free to jump in. Tom Fody. Okay, maybe it was something in the chat. It wasn't a question for us. Great. All right. Thank you all for that. And let's move on to our second to last agenda item. This is to review and populate the advisory panel membership. And I will turn it over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two nominations for your consideration and approval. Eben Wilson and Jeff Putnam, both commercial trap fishermen from Maine. Their nominations were provided in the original materials, and it is supported by the full Maine delegation.
Excellent. Thank you, Tina. So is there, does anyone want to offer a motion for the advisory panel? Pat Kelleher, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we add Eben Wilson and Jeff Putnam to the Lobster Advisory Panel.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Wait for that to get up. While that's put up on the board, is there a second? Cherie, I saw your hand first. Was that for the second, Cherie? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for that. So we've got a motion to approve the two advisory panel nominations, moved by Pat Kelleher, seconded by Cherie Patterson. Any discussion on this before I call the question? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, I will call the question. Are there any objections? Oh, thanks for putting the names on there. Any objections to the motion on the board? Seeing none, we'll consider this motion approved by consent. Thanks for that. And finally, to Pat had requested an item be added under other business. So Pat, whenever you are ready, please feel free to make your case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be brief, knowing that I'm standing in the way of lunch. The public hearings that I was able to listen into regarding the tracker addendum, I would say moderately well attended, but of those attending, several good questions were raised regarding the technical nature of trackers, the need for staying at the dock or not staying at the dock if a tracker is not using. But in general, there were a lot of trackers. And then I had another follow-up conversation with Richie White of New Hampshire about, does there need to be a delay? My feeling was, and we talked this through, is that we don't need a delay, but what might be very beneficial is if states would be willing to take any questions that were not well answered through the public hearing process and send those into Caitlin, so the PDT could pull together answers prior to the special board meeting that is going to be scheduled for later this winter. So that would be my suggestion, Mr. Chairman, that we all put together those questions and submit them to staff.
Awesome, thanks, Pat. So the suggestion is, if questions are coming up on the tracker action, please get those in early so that we can try our best to keep this on track. So I think that's good advice. Anybody wish to make a comment on that? Okay, seeing no hands, sounds like people like your advice, Pat. I do as well, so thanks for that. With that, I think we have come to the end of the agenda. Sorry about running a little long. My stomach is grumbling, so I think we should wrap up here. So is there a motion to adjourn? Motion made by Pat Kelleher. Is there a second? Seconded by Cherie. Any objections to ending this meeting and going to lunch? Seeing no hands, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all very much. Really appreciated your help on that. And see you at the next one. Thanks, everyone.